Cam here from Xano Support, and we're going to continue on today with our second video on our to-do app, where we're going to take a look at user registration and creating resources. So we had our middleware out of the way. Now it's about taking these ideas on our wireframe and turning them into an actual app. Let's go ahead and continue on, and let's get started. So just like in the last video, we're going to start off looking at our low fidelity wireframe. And we're going to be focusing primarily on the sign up page and the add a to-do page. So what we can see here with our sign up page, we're sending in a name, a username, an email, a password, and then on our front end, we have this repeat password. And typically the front end handles the enforcement of that repeat password. You can build it out on the back end, but this is just going to be a front end security measure. Otherwise, we do have to ask ourselves, are these usernames going to be unique? And we've already answered that question in the last videos. We were going over database rules and setting unique indexes. So yes, these usernames will be unique. Otherwise, once they have signed up, we're sending them to this add a to-do page where they can add a title, a due date, and they'll be able to provide task content. So we are familiar with the way that the structure is set up, where we have a user who has a role, and then we have a to-do list, which has tasks. What we want to be able to do when we send a user, once they've just registered and they're going to be adding a task, we want them to already have a list generated. Otherwise, when they add a task, there's no list associated and we could run into some problems. So that's just the first thing that we want to think about. Now, of course, that's coming. But first, let's just focus on that sign up page. So we'll go back to Xano, and inside Xano, we'll head to our API default group. And if you don't have a default group, you can add an API group in the top right-hand corner. In the same way, if you don't have authentication endpoints, you can add them in the top right-hand corner and selecting authentication, and I'm focusing on sign up here specifically. So in our sign up endpoint, you can see that we have some inputs that are coming through: our name, our email, and our password, but we have that username on our wireframe that we need to pass in. So we'll just add this as an input. It'll be text, and we'll just type the word username. Great. So the way that this function stack works is we find the user, and we're finding the user by their email column. We'll go ahead and return if that user is true or not, or if that user exists. And if that user doesn't exist, that means we can then add that user. And you can see here, we have some information that we can fill out for that user. And then an auth token is returned to our front end. The auth token is going to be handled on the front end. That is going to be the front end's responsibility for ensuring that that auth token can be stored. So we have the process of what happens. Now we need to go ahead and ask ourselves what needs to change. Well, first off, we need to check if that username exists. So there's a couple different ways to go about it, but we're checking if an email exists at the moment. We also need to check if that username exists. So what I'm going to do on this get record from user, just right at the top, I'm going to add a conditional. So we'll just type in the word conditional or find it right at the top and add it in. So what we need to check is, well, the condition that the precondition is actually referencing. User is null. We're going to check if the user is null because that means their email is null. But then we need to check if the username is null. So what we can do is we can go ahead and select that user variable, click that blue pencil, and we'll say user is null. So again, just making sure that the email user is not found. If that's the case, then what we can do, and I want to use a query all records. So database requests and a query all records, where we're going to search here, in this case, for our user table. We're going to go to our custom query, and what are we searching for? Well, we want to make sure that that user.username equals our username that we're passing in as an input. I'm going to go to my output here, and I'm going to click on this blue return, where I'll change that return type to an exists, which will be a true or false. And I can update this variable to be user exists. So if this user exists, what do we need to do? Well, we need to trigger another precondition. We're actually going to be leveraging this precondition and another precondition. So let's go ahead and just clone this real quick. I'll drag it under my then. So I have this precondition under my then, and what do I need this to be? My precondition in that blue pencil there, I need to be measuring that user exists equals false. The user shouldn't exist. Otherwise, this account is already in use. And we can say that this username is already in use. Cool. And we'll go ahead and click save. We can leave it just like that. We'll take that precondition that we sort of ignored and we can actually drag it into the else because it can satisfy the argument. We can also leave it out in theory, but I just like to compartmentalize and organize all of my functions. So we have the email being checked. We're then conditionally checking if that user exists or not. If they don't exist, well, before we do anything else, let's just check, does that username that they're passing in exist? If it does, we'll throw this error. And then of course, if the user is, by default, their email is not found, we just, again, want to check that in that precondition. Otherwise, once we get through this chain of logic, we're going to add that user. Now, real quick, before we do that, I just like to edit the descriptions of these conditionals, and this checks if the username is already taken. Cool. So we just want to measure if that email and username have been taken. I'll collapse my conditional here. And the next thing that I need to do, well, I need to think about that task ID list, or that task list rather, that is going to be responsible for holding tasks in the next process. You can, of course, always decide to generate the task list then when they're creating a post. But what I want to do is I want to think about this in a way where we can eliminate the amount of headaches. Every user should have one list associated with them. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and click that blue plus sign and we'll add a record. The record is that to-do list. And we'll go ahead and select the user ID. The user ID in this case will be from the user that we just created. So if I click on this and look at its output, I can see that I can reference user and then using dot notation or a get filter, the ID path. So let's go ahead and do that. I'll go ahead and select our user. And again, using dot notation or the get filter, this get filter is going to prevent errors in the event that the user ID is not found. However, of course, it would be very weird if that was the case in this situation. So you have the option of using a get filter just like this. Or in this case, you can go ahead and set an ID using dot notation. Now we also have this name that we're creating. And I think it's probably pretty useful to go over what we can do with names. That is, we can go ahead and make this dynamic by passing in a string and then manipulating that string with dynamic content. So what I'd like to say is that this is going to be names task. So let's go ahead and just say names task list. And in fact, I'll delete that period. What we can do now is we can search for a string. In this case, we're going to search for the name. The way that we do this is we copy our name, we add a filter, and we go to our replace filter. We're searching for that value. So I just pasted that value. And what are we actually looking to pass in? Well, it would be the name input. So this name will get replaced with the name being input, and then we'll say task list. If we wanted to, we could also add a capitalize filter either to the input or to the entire group. And let's do that just to the entire string. So I capitalize each first letter of each word here, and we can click save. So what we're doing is we're creating a user, and then we're creating their to-do list. But before that, of course, we're checking if a username exists already or not. Let's go ahead and publish this and just double check on what this looks like. So using the name Cameron and the email cameron.b@xano.com with a super secure password 123. And then the username of Cameron, we should be able to click run. And this account is already in use because I have that Cameron.b email from last time. Chris, Cameron, and Louis are within this data table. So what if we just supply a different email address, cameron.c@xano.com? We do get that token back. Let's go ahead and change the email now to cameron.d, that username here of Cameron. We should get an error. And it says that a duplicate record has been detected. So that unique index is working for us. Now, what I also want to double check though is if this query is set up correctly. If I query this, so our user.username equals input.username, this is going to come back with an exists, a true or a false. We want it to equal false. Otherwise, we want a different error message to be thrown. Let's just double check here real quick. If we go to our database and then go to our user, we can see that our username table can probably be set to null. This might be one of the reasons we have this error here. So I'll change my type text setting to null. Okay. What doesn't look like my username here is actually being caught. So if we go to add record and user, we can go ahead and then update our username. And there you go. That was the issue. We actually need to go into our user record and map those inputs to that function, or in this case, the add record. We also have this roles ID, and we can hard code it, manually set it here, or from the database rules. And we did the database rules in the last video. So I'll just click this I and disable it. Let's go ahead and publish this. Try it one more time. I do need to go back to that database though real quick. So I'll go to database, users, and I'll just delete this user here. And back into my API, back into my sign up. Let's try it one more time. So Cameron B should throw an error. The account's already in use. And if we do Cameron C, I should be able to create this account. Amazing. Changing the email, but keeping the username. Perfect. So we get all the errors as we should, checking the email and checking the username. Let's just go ahead and double check that Cameron.c has a to-do list. So the user, Cameron.c, perfect. All this information looks correct. And then we can go to their to-do list where we've successfully mapped that information and made it dynamic. So it's Cameron's task list with that capitalized filter applied. This reference appears when you've deleted information that would otherwise be mapped to this table reference. We can delete this for now to avoid any confusion. But what we should now focus on here is the creation of the actual task. So we have the ability now to register the user. They can go ahead and sign up, and we just ensure that we create a to-do list. Perfect. If we head to our API and our default group, we want to focus on this post tasks endpoint. When we head to this endpoint, what we can see here is that we have some information, our to-do list ID that's going to be passed in, the name, the description, the order, the due date, and the completed. We don't need some of this information, such as the order. This can be calculated on the backend, and as well as the completed, because when you add an item, it's not going to be completed. Let's go ahead and reference our design real quick. So heading back here, we can see that when we're adding a to-do, we're adding that title, a due date, a task. It is going to need that to-do list. And then in addition to that, we are trying to ensure that it adheres to the structure or the ordering. So I said that that order didn't need to be passed in from the front. It doesn't. We can calculate it on the back. Let's assume here that when we're adding a to-do, that it adds to the end of the due date list that it belongs to. So that if we were to add a task, the next one would have the order of 4. That's the way that I want to go ahead and approach this. So we'll just disable order and completed. Now this to-do list ID is going to be important. How do we get that information? So before we go ahead and add a task, before we focus on the logic of this endpoint, we should figure out how we're going to get this to-do list ID. Let's go ahead and head back to our auth grouping here, where we have our auth me endpoint. Now, conventionally and traditionally in development, you will have the auth me endpoint that is oftentimes called to get pertinent information about the logged in user. This is typically a conventional endpoint that would be used at any time that you need information about a user. And in this case, it would be very helpful to have information about a user and their task list that we added. So I want to do this by heading to the output. It's going to be the easiest way. We can enrich that user information without needing to query a different data table. We can just simply click this add-on button. Now we have a to-do list add-on that we have from our other video. We can create another add-on that uses a different value from our output here. So what we want is a to-do list, and we want a single item, and we want to map our user ID here from our user table. We can also sort this so that we always get the most recent task list, so that when we query this auth me endpoint, we always have their default, so to speak, task list. We can go ahead and update that sort. So to-do_list.created@, and then the order by would be descending. So the first will be the highest order, and then it'll continue downward. So we'll click next, and this is the to-do list of a user. We'll create the add-on. I like to delete that underscore and then click done, where we'll then go ahead and click save and publish. So Let's test this out by passing in Cameron's auth token and clicking run. And you can see here, perfect. We've enriched data, just like we did last time, but this time on a different endpoint. And in fact, it's the same query, but just looking at a different value. So we add this to-do list and we have this ID now that we can pass in from the front end. So the reason that we've gone over this auth.me endpoint here is because ideally what would end up happening is that after a user is logged in, you would query your auth.me endpoint. That auth.me endpoint then would load that to-do task ID that we can then use when we click this button, sending it to our endpoint. Let's go back to our endpoint here where we are creating that task. So we now know how to get our to-do list ID. We can go ahead and pass in a task name or a title, a description, and the due date. So when we open this record, let's go ahead and disable this completed. The next thing that we need to do is calculate this order. So the way that this is going to work is that we're going to add a database request, query all records, and we are going to query for our tasks. We are going to go to our custom query and we're going to refine this search such that the task to-do list, the tasks.to-do list ID equals our to-do list ID input. And because the ordering is specific to the due date, we need to make sure that the tasks.due date equals the input due date. So go ahead and click save, and I'll drag my query all records above my tasks. So let's click back on that query all records and head to our output where I'm going to go to my return blue pencil and I'm going to change my return type to a count. So it's going to return me a number of items that exist. We can actually introduce the very cool stop and debug function. So I'll just add the stop and debug under my tasks and I'll select that I want my tasks1 to be the variable returned. I'll go ahead and pass in a to-do list ID of 1 and a due date in the following string, which will be date, month, and then day. So we'll click run again, and there are 0 matches. So what we do with this information is now use a math filter. So I can go ahead and disable this stop and debug. I'll click on my tasks, and in my order, what I'll be able to do is reference this variable above. I don't like this variable name though, so let me just go to my output. I've clicked on it and I'm going to change this to task count. And I'll update the references so that now when I go back here, all I have to do is select task count, add the filter of add, it's a math filter, and we'll go ahead and add the value of 1. And we'll go ahead and click save. So let's just double check this is doing what we want here. So we have our order that's going to be calculated on the backend by just finding out how many exist. And then everything else should be mapped as is. Looks good to me. So let's go ahead and click save. I'll publish this. And now the moment of truth. That is, we can create a task and we can go ahead and make sure that we are giving it a name and a description, a date. We don't need an order. We click this reset button. We can see that now it's updated to reflect the items that we've removed. So selecting Cameron.b, our to-do list of 1, I'll add a task name and I'll call this first test task from the API. And the description will be, this is a test. The due date will be that string in our year, month, day format. And I'll click run where, look at this, we are returned a record. The to-do list ID is what we've passed in. That order has incremented to 1. So if we were to pass in a second test task and click run again, we can see that that order actually then updates. But if we change this date at all, we can then see that that order resets. So everything is working the way that we want it to. Now, I've added this pre-middleware. I've gone into my settings for my API and clicked in my middleware and then added access control. What I should be able to do is pass in a different user for a to-do list that is assigned to me, Cameron.b, and I should be able to get an error message. So we'll select Louis here and we'll go ahead and select run again. And perfect, our pre-middleware is working. So what we've done is we've registered the user. We've ensured that we've created all of the necessary information for them. And we've also created this endpoint for our tasks where we generate the order dynamically and then add that record. In addition to that, we also have focused on our auth.me endpoint and adding an add-on that is going to find that to-do list of our user or the most recent to-do list. All of this together, we now have the ability to create a collection of to-do lists and then query them. The next step is to then query all of these tasks, as well as then subscribe to them via email so that you can be notified when they are then completed. So we'll take a look at triggers and some other really cool pieces of tech that Xano has introduced for us. So with that said, you now have the ability to pass in information from the front end to the back end, create things that then store in your database, and have role access. If you have any questions, please go ahead and leave them in the comment section below. Otherwise, you can reach out to us through the community or on the left-hand side, our support chat. Until next time, have a great one.